We were talking about the original Phillips curve and how this relationship held during the 1960s, where we saw a trade-off between unemployment rate and inflation rate, where lower unemployment was associated with higher inflation, higher unemployment was associated with lower inflation. So this relationship was observed in the 1960s. And then we discussed how this Phillips curve broke down in the 1970s. Over here, like when we saw that, when you plotted inflation rate and unemployment rate, there was no negative trade-off, but rather the points were scattered in a roughly symmetric line, right? So over here in the 1960s, when you plotted inflation rate against unemployment, there was a clear trade-off. But in the 1970s, we could not see that trade-off when we plotted inflation rate against unemployment rate. And we looked at the reasons why this relationship broke down. Now I want to discuss that the original relationship between inflation rate and unemployment broke down, but a new relation emerged this time between the unemployment rate. On the horizontal axis, look, we still have the unemployment rate. But on the vertical axis, now we're not looking at the relationship of the unemployment rate with the inflation rate, but rather with the change in inflation. And now we could see a clear negative relation between the unemployment rate and the change in the inflation rate. So if we go back, originally, see, the trade-off was we still had unemployment rate on horizontal axis, but here the trade-off was with the inflation rate. Now there was still a negative relationship in the 1970s where you still had unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, but the trade-off was now with change in inflation rate. Now notice over it's change in inflation rate, not inflation rate. So this relationship became known as the accelerationist Phillips curve, where the unemployment rate affects not the inflation rate, but rather the change in the inflation. Here, the trade-off is between unemployment and inflation. But now in the 1970s, what we saw was a trade-off between unemployment rate and change in inflation rate. This is what became known as the accelerationist Phillips curve. Now let's discuss in detail the accelerationist Phillips curve. Sometimes this is referred to as modified or expectation augmented Phillips curve. Now, the accelerationist Phillips curve assumes inflation expectations in each period are equal to inflation from the previous period. So, they're equal to previous year's inflation rate. So, now pi t is equal to pi t minus 1. If we go back to the original Phillips curve, remember we said the original Phillips curve assumes that inflation expectations are anchored, i.e. they are formed around some fixed number, they're anchored at some value, where pi t is equal to pi bar, where pi bar is the value around which inflation varies from year to year. But when we talk about accelerationist Phillips curve, so this now assumes that inflation expectations are not constant, but depend upon last year's inflation. So assumes people expect inflation this year to be what it was last year. So the original Phillips curve assumes pi t is pi bar. You have anchored inflation expectations. Expectations are anchored at some value. The accelerationist Phillips curve assumes de-anchored inflation expectations, where your expectations are no longer constant, but they are equal to last year's inflation. And these expectations are likely to form when inflation shows a strong correlation between years, as was in the case in the United States during the 1970s. Right? So we know, okay, the reason the original Phillips curve broke down was that inflation became more persistent. High inflation in one year became more likely to be followed by high inflation in the next year. So people started to take that into account when forming inflation expectations, because now you have this strong correlation. Because like we said, in the case of the original Phillips curve, pi t is pi bar is reasonable when inflation is stable. So you can ignore past inflation, giving you the original Phillips curve. But then we talked about how pi t minus 1 is reasonable when inflation is more persistent and there's a strong correlation between of inflation between years. So in that case, you have the accelerationist Phillips curve.